Hello, my name is Mary, and the article I will be talking about today is called How to Learn Effectively in Medical School, Test Yourself, Learn Actively, and Repeat in Intervals by Mark Augustin. Mass repetition is when we cram information prior to an exam and only remember it in the short term. With spaced repetition, we reinforce knowledge over time, which leads to long-term retention. Forgetting is the process of losing information that's stored in our memory and being unable to retrieve it over time. In this curve, you can see that as time passes, our memory fades, and it implies that new factual knowledge will be forgotten if we only learn it one time. The two types of knowledge described are factual and procedural. Factual knowledge is also known as conceptual, and it describes the what of information. An example would be memorizing the different classes of antibiotics. With procedural knowledge, this describes the how or why, and typically this is learned with simulation and practice over time. The majority of knowledge taught in medical school or in medical education is factual knowledge, and this often leaves students feeling overwhelmed and with a low long-term retention. This article describes ways to improve our factual knowledge retention in medical education through the testing effect, active recall, and spaced repetitions. Overall, practice improves our memory. Testing at this time is typically when students learn information, they read facts, summarize them, restudy, and then memorize them to just recall them one time on a written or oral exam. Testing is a way to assess our knowledge, but it's not usually part of the learning process. This is something that's challenged in the current article. In the article, they describe that students are not usually aware of the superiority of testing versus studying. Repeated testing is also something described. One study showed that learning new information one time and actively recalling it with free recall improved retention versus studying that same information 4 times without retaining it and without immediate testing. In the second study, they showed that repeated testing significantly higher long-term retention more than repeated studying. Initial feedback is another significant component of the testing effect, and this is when the educator reviews what was answered correctly or incorrectly. This usually enhances learning. An important thing to note is that testing was still shown to be superior regardless of whether this feedback occurred. Active recall requires effort, and it's something that we consciously do. Usually testing is done with immediate feedback, as mentioned in the previous slide. This is when we need to reproduce information previously learned without being cued. Usually, testing occurs with multiple choice exams versus immediate recall of information. Quizzing is superior to studying as it can result in less than half the time to recall the same information. And usually more difficult testing can result in stimulated subsequent learning. Spaced repetition is something that has a positive effect on long-term retention. There are 2 important aspects to describe. Retrieval practice after initial learning is the main contributor in successful learning. It should be performed on expanding intervals to further enhance learning over time. A group shown in the article performed better when having expanding intervals versus the same interval within these testing periods, shown in the graphic here. Another thing is that we can space these learning episodes based on the length of time we want to retain the information. So if we want to retain information for 1 week, we would want to space the learning intervals over 12 to 24 hours. If we want to retain for 1 year, it would be for 2 months. And for 5 years, we would space them 6 to 12 months apart. One last example of applying this spaced repetition model to medicine was described in a recent study. Pharmacology is a difficult subject in medical education that students often express unease with learning. This study created a method to address the gaps in pharmacology education within medical students. They conducted first an initial anonymous survey to gather information, and they then developed a flashcard resource to support long-term retention. They then conducted an end-of-year anonymous survey again to evaluate how well the intervention helped with learning. The students gave an overall global rating of 3.8 out of 5, and they described that the resource was comprehensive and well formatted, and they did think it was a strategic tool to reinforce learning. As you can see in the top graphic, any answers that were answered correctly would move on to the next learning episode, versus anything that was answered incorrectly would go back to the beginning and then be repeated more over time. So in conclusion, for effectively learning factual knowledge, students should test themselves, actively recall information, and utilize spaced repetition to retest at expanding intervals. Implementing this practice can be done in the early stage of schooling using these concepts. Curriculum should be based on shorter modules that are repeated in expanding intervals to reinforce information over time. And lastly, we need to teach students how to learn before they can start learning. Here are my resources for this week's lecture, or very short lecture, but if you have any questions, please write in the discussion post and I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you so much. Have a good day.